So I'm recording my homily for the fifth Sunday in Ordinary Time, and for my day off, I came out once again to the Sisters' Place on Shaw Island for the Mercy Sisters, and so it's a beautiful day. It just snowed, or it's snowing a little bit, and so just a very peaceful, beautiful day. So the gospel this weekend is the gospel where, Jesus Christ is so amazing how he can take the height of our teachings, he can take the most powerful things that we believe and bring them down to the level that even a very small child could completely grasp and understand and live. And so today he uses an example of salt, right? And so he calls us to be the salt of the earth, to be something that's very flavorful, something that gives life, right? It attracts, it makes something, to use an analogy of food, it makes something delicious. He also uses light, which he uses over and over throughout the Gospels. I want to talk about the analogy, though, of salt, and I'm going to take it a little bit farther and see if it can't help us understand just how God's working in our life. So, when I was growing up, we didn't eat salt. We didn't use salt. Salt was, in my house, because we ate very healthy, it was something that, it caused heart problems, right? And sugar caused diabetes, and so salt and sugar were not really in our house. But when we would go out to eat, then salt was fair game because there was salt on the table. And so I remember this one time as a kid, we went out to eat and for breakfast, and I saw the salt, and it's like, I am going to make up for all the salt that I've been deprived of through my life. And so I just poured a ton of salt onto my eggs. And it was so bad, I couldn't even eat it. Now, so here's the first analogy. What is it like when we use too much salt? So if Jesus is calling us to be the salt of the earth, what is it like when we use too much salt? Well, too much salt makes it horrible. We can't eat it. We can't, we don't want it. And so I want to talk about how spiritually, in a sense, we can use too much salt. It's kind of like when we try too hard, we go off track. So what are some examples of that? Have you ever felt like you were becoming pushy with your faith, or becoming too pushy, or somebody was doing that to you? And so let's say you're trying to live your faith, but then somebody comes along and they're just really pushy, and they're just constantly pushing. And it makes you feel uncomfortable. It makes you feel like, I just want out. I just want to step back. Maybe somebody's trying to convert you to a different faith, right? And they're being very, very pushy about it. That's like too much salt. It's not being done right. Now, there are times we need to have courage. There's times we need to push. But we also need to be able to discern when it's too much, and we're just hurting. We're not helping. What about with your kids? Your kids are, maybe they're rebelling and they're pushing away, and parents will say this frequently. They'll say, I'm afraid to push too hard because I'm afraid I'll push them farther away. And so they're recognizing that there is times when we can have too much salt. Now, becoming pushy doesn't mean that we're trying to push something that's good. It means we've gone off the tracks a little bit. It means something failed. And so we need to recoup that rather than just keep pushing harder and harder. Just to go into this a little bit more. So in the Catholic Church, we're known for guilt, right? People will often joke about Catholic guilt. And that irritates me a little bit. So if I'm feeling in a little feisty mood, I might say something like, I wonder what the world would be like without guilt. Can you imagine a world where nobody felt guilty for anything they did? Right? We would eat each other alive. It would be absolute anarchy. And so guilt has a place. Now guilt is simply our conscience, which is God's voice, right? Our conscience saying to us, that this is right or this is wrong. And so guilt is often when we've done something wrong and our conscience is speaking to us and saying, this is not right. So there's nothing bad about that. It's actually very critical. However, if all we use is guilt, if all we use is the fact that we can make people feel bad for something they've done or something they might do, then it's too much salt. We've gone off the rails. We've missed something, right? We've missed the center focus, and we've gone too far one direction. Now, using too much guilt or just using guilt can often lead to the other path, which is just fear. You know, it's easier to get somebody to be afraid than it is to get somebody to be in love. And so even in the Catholic Church in the past, we tried to scare people into heaven. We tried to make them so afraid of hell that they'll back their way into heaven. And that's too much salt, right? That's not necessarily what we want. We want them to understand the truth, but not just to be acting out of fear. Now, fear is actually easy to create. It doesn't take that much work. Love, on the other hand, love you have to construct. You have to dig the foundation. You have to have a good foundation put in, and you have to build the building correctly in order for there to be love, in order for love to be constructed well. And that takes work. And it takes a lot of work. And the thing is that we're never done. Love is never finished. It's a constant process of building it and strengthening it. And then we keep adding on and adding on. That's the thing, is that we're never done. But that's also the beauty of it. Whereas fear is not like that. Fear does not attract. Too much salt, right? Okay. Now let's go in the opposite direction. Let's go when it's too little salt. There's not enough salt. So what is food like when it doesn't have enough salt? Well, it's bland, it's not flavorful. You know, you might eat your food at that restaurant, but you're probably, if you like good food, you're probably not going to go back to that restaurant, right? And so when our lives become bland, when there's not enough salt. Have you ever had somebody come up to you and say something like, you know, you've known them for years, you've known them for 10, 15 years, maybe they're a coworker, and they come up to you and they say, I didn't know you were Catholic. You know, and it hurts to hear that, I think, because we realize that we were living with too little salt. If somebody can't tell that we are a person of faith, or that we're Catholic, after years and years, then it means we're living with too little salt. It means something's not quite right. That doesn't mean that we need to go the opposite extreme and be pushy, but it just means we're not living our faith with the flavor that we should be. Okay? Now, what are things, you know, there's all kinds of little things that we can do in our life which cause Jesus Christ to stand out from the language that we use, or the language we refuse to use, like bad language or dirty jokes or things like that. People notice when we don't join in things, when we have a lot of discipline and we're not joining in the company gossip. And I'll tell you, that takes a lot of discipline to not join in that. But people notice those things. I remember, you know, I hate to say this because I don't want to scandalize you, but in the seminary there was a lot of gossip. And there was one seminarian who's now a priest for our diocese. He would never join in it. And it really impressed me. I wish I could say I was that disciplined. But I remember his example. He was a very positive person, and he would never join in the gossip. Okay, so too little salt. Now I want to take, let's go a little bit more with the too little salt. So, you know, when you go to church, and you know, we as Catholics, we sit in the same place pretty much every time. We start sitting around the same people frequently. And so a question to ask ourselves to say, you know, is there too little salt in my life, is, have I ever tried to get to know the people around me? Or for years and years, have they just been strangers to me? Do I even know their names? You know, I come to Mass, I come to the most intimate spiritual event in the world where heaven is brought down to earth, or heaven is made alive here on earth in the Mass. And I'm content just with being a stranger to the people around me. Too little salt. Something's wrong, right? Do I do works of the gospel? Do I do works of charity with the people that I come to Mass with? Or do they continue to be strangers week after week, year after year? Then it means there's too little salt. Something's not right, right? We're not being a light to the nations if that's happening. Okay, so I want to use the idea of too little salt to build up to the correct amount of salt, to make something really flavorful, where our lives are attractive, where people are drawn to what we have in terms of faith. In the Bible, there's a couple ways that it describes people in our world who are in need, people who need help, right? And I think this is important because basically what it's saying is there's places in our world where there's too little salt, and we have the ability to bring flavor to it, to bring something back into it that gives it light, that brings joy back in, brings peace back in. And so where are the places in our world that we need to do that? And then once we know that, we can bring that flavor, that salt back in. So in the Bible, it'll often talk about the widows and the orphans, right? The widows and the orphans. The widows and the orphans were the people who often had too little salt in their life. Life was tough. Life was unfair in some ways. It was unjust. And so in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, there's always a push to bring light, to bring salt back in to their lives, to bring love back in. So the orphan, well, we say, well, we don't have orphans in the United States today. But we do. They're just different. So if you go to Haiti, and I remember going to Port-au-Prince in Haiti, and we went to, the baby hospital there that's run by the Missionaries of Charity, and it's the first time in my life I held a baby that was just a skeleton. I mean, just skin and bones. And it wasn't necessarily that they didn't have enough food there, but there was no nutrition. And so the mother's body couldn't help the child overcome their illness. And so the babies just slowly started starving to death because they didn't have the nutrients to fight the illnesses that they had. And so I remember holding these babies, and the babies would just cling. I mean, they would just cling. You thought they were weak, but they're actually really strong. And they would just cling to you. And it was like they were just feeding off of an affection, right? That was part of the healing. Here in the United States, we don't necessarily have babies that are starving to death. We don't have a shortage of food. In fact, if anything, we're probably the exact opposite. However, we do have spiritual poverty. We do have spiritual orphans. Now, you may know, like when you were growing up, did you ever have friends that seemed to spend an awful lot of time over at your house? And then when you went over to their house always seemed to be dysfunctional. There was always like arguing, or there wasn't a lot of love. And so that child was drawn to your family because there was more love there, because there was probably more of everything there. And so they were drawn to that. And so that's the nature of when there's an orphan, when we're being orphaned, that we're drawn to the light, we're drawn to the salt, right? What are some other examples? What about drug usage? Heroin addicts. We see them around, or homeless people who, they are orphans, right? There's different types of examples. When I was back at my last parish in Lakewood, we would have kids who would often hang around the parish, and they would be, with their skateboards and stuff, and I would often walk up to them and say, so you do realize you can't use your skateboard here unless you have a Catholic skateboard. And it was at least a way to start a conversation, right? But I would talk to these kids, and some of them would have no concept of Jesus. I mean, zero concept. The parents had done nothing to give them anything spiritual whatsoever. And so their life was confined. They were orphans to this material world, and they had nothing that would connect them to heaven. Okay, we have that, and it's very common here in the United States. And so we pay attention to the spiritual orphans in our world. We say, we need to bring Jesus Christ there. There's too little salt out there, and so therefore we're the salt shaker. I know that sounds dumb. All right. So orphans, what about widows? You know, widows, we can expand that out to people who've just, they've had injustice in their life. Life's been hard. They lost their spouse. Maybe, you know, some people in the military, their spouse was killed in combat, and now they have to raise the kids, and they have to work, and then they have to do all these things, and life's just tough. And so we pay attention to the people where they've been dealt a raw deal in life. Life's tough. And so we look for them, because that's where we can bring salt. That's where we can add flavor. The last one I want to bring up is a term that's used in the Bible, but it's a term I read just recently, and it bothered me, and so I want to use it to describe another type of group of people that often need help. And it's the alien. Now, not E.T., right? Not the guy from outer space, but the alien, the person who is not from here, the person who is a foreigner, they are a stranger. Now, I was reading the executive decisions by President Trump the other day because I was getting frustrated because I didn't know what they actually said. You're hearing all these news articles and people are very emotional, but I didn't know what they actually said. So I went to the White House website. There's a website for the White House, and they have the full text of these executive decisions. Well, two of them were with regards to immigration. And the word that they always used to describe the immigrant was an alien. And as I was reading that, it kind of bothered me, because I thought, well, what if I was the alien? I mean, do I feel like when somebody calls me an alien, so they say, oh, there's an alien, do I feel like I have the fullness of my human dignity? Or do I feel like the people view me as something that's subhuman? The term alien. It kind of reminds me, I've used this example many times before, but it's the way we view sometimes immigration, the same way we view abortion. And so in immigration, we say, well, that's an alien, right? We don't say that's a human being. We say that's an alien, because when we call them an alien, it's easier to dismiss their life and say, you know what, they came here illegally, we have the right to get them out. We don't want them here if they're here illegally. If they're breaking the laws, get them out, right? And so it's much easier to reduce their humanity down to an unpleasant cancer that's present here. Abortion's the same way. And so the person who has this baby within them will never call it a baby. They'll call it a fetus or an embryo, or even a term that's even more dehumanizing, a lump of whatever, right? A lump of cells. And they'll describe that child the same way they describe the alien. They'll say, well, this is a child that is unwanted. They have violated the boundaries of this woman's body, and the woman has the right to control her body. And so she has the right to remove this intrusion, this fetus, this embryo, whatever it is. And so it's her decision to protect her borders, to protect her body from that cancer, that intrusion. So you see how we use the language the same way. So I say the first thing is that when we speak of somebody who's a foreigner, a stranger, somebody who's lost, somebody who doesn't fit in, we got to be very careful. We have to be very careful about that. Because Jesus Christ, as he wandered around, sought those people out. They were the reason he existed, in a sense. He would constantly seek them, and so the alien, the person who's alienated themselves because of their own decisions, their sinfulness, their addictions, or sometimes even it's because of what's happened to them. You think of the people who are victims of sexual abuse, how they're never really welcomed back into society because society can't deal with their level of woundedness. And so in some ways, whether we try it or not, they seem to be cast out. Or what about people you think in the past of the church, people who were divorced. And I'm not talking about people who were divorced and then remarried outside the church. People who were just divorced. They were often cast out. They were looked down upon. And they had made a decision, maybe because it was domestic violence, there was violence in the home, they were being abused, and so they decided that they couldn't handle it any longer. And instead of supporting them or providing them with something that would help them in their life, we cast them out. Pope Francis is often talking about that these days, right? And so Jesus would often seek them out to heal them. And so that's the idea of us having salt, is that we can bring salt to where there's not enough, right? There's something beautiful about our mission to do that, to be the salt of the earth, to be down here and to be able to do that. A number of years ago when I was a child, we would come up to the Seattle area from Texas on vacation in the summer, and I remember my grandmother talking about some of the neighbors in the neighborhood in Seattle. So she lived in Ballard, a very Norwegian neighborhood, a very white neighborhood. And a black family was attempting to purchase a house in that neighborhood. And she was describing how the neighbors had banded together and went to the real estate agent and told the real estate agent, said, if you sell a house to that family, to that black family, you will never work in this neighborhood again, right? Too little salt. It's what destroys life and makes it very unflavorful. It makes it very unpleasant, makes it bland. So how we as Christians live our life in moments like that, in moments, things happening around us, is very important, because it determines whether or not we're going to be the salt of the earth. And the brutal reality, and I'm not saying this just to scare you, but the brutal reality is if we fail to do that, we're not going to heaven. Jesus was very clear, right? So we want to be the salt of the earth. We want to be that love. So when I say salt, what am I really describing? I'm describing God's grace. I'm describing also... Keep moving forward. I'm describing God's grace, but I'm also describing just the nature of love, how love works in our world. And so we want to be able to be instruments of bringing that love in. I was having dinner with a family a couple nights ago, and both the husband and the wife were converts to the Catholic faith, and the husband just kept saying over and over how he said, with the Catholic faith, and they were always good Christians, but with the Catholic faith, he says, you just can't tap it. You just keep going deeper and deeper and deeper, and there's always more. It's always flavorful. You just want to keep having more. It tastes good. And so that's a beautiful thing. That's what we want. We want our presence in the world to be something that's so attractive that people say, I want more, right? I just want to use a last example, an example of St. John Bosco. St. John Bosco's feast day was just a few days ago. It was January 31st. And so St. John Bosco, as a little boy, he grew up in a difficult home. His mom worked really hard. She was basically busy all day long, just trying to make enough so that there was food on the table. They were very poor. I don't remember exactly what happened to his father. I think his father may have been deceased. I don't remember. But he was not part of the picture. And then there was another person. It was like a brother or a brother-in-law or someone who just made life miserable. It just wasn't a very pleasant person. And so John just kind of grew up in that environment. But there was something very special about his desire to share the gospel. Now, as a little boy, he thought he could never be a priest. He wanted to be a priest because back then you had to pay for your education in the seminary, and they were poor. And so he didn't really think that would ever happen. But he still had this magnanimism. He still had this desire to share the gospel. And so he learned how to do these little circus tricks. He learned how to juggle. He learned how to do the backflip. He learned how to walk on a rope. And then he would go down on Saturdays, down into the town square where everybody was there shopping. And he would do these little tricks, and he would draw in all the kids who were his age, and they would be kind of fascinated by it. And then after a little while, he would sit them down and he would share with them Bible stories. He would share with them Jesus. And so he would just try to be that salt. He had a desire for it. It was just love. He wasn't being pushy. He wasn't being afraid to share his faith either. But it was just right. It was something very beautiful about his love. Now, if you fast forward many years, he becomes a priest. And at the time, he was a tutor for a wealthy family. But one day he goes down to the prison, and he notices in the prison, in the jail there, it's just packed with teenage boys. And it was very common back then that because families were very poor, that when a teenage boy was able to fend for himself, they kicked him out of the house, right? He's got to go fend for himself. Well, a lot of them got into trouble, and so they're filling the jail. So St. John Bosco, still having that salt, wanted to help them. And so he founded trade schools, he founded normal schools, he founded an orphanage for them to live. But he also gave them faith. He gave them Jesus, right? We can't just give people food or shelter. We have to give them also faith. We have to share with them Jesus Christ. As Jesus said, one does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes forth from the mouth of God. And so people are desiring that. And so we need to be able to share that. So he started all these things, and before you know it, he had hundreds and hundreds of teenage boys who were part of his group, part of his institution that he was forming. And then he decided to start a religious order that would be dedicated to boys, especially boys who were getting in trouble, but to boys. And he created a whole curriculum, a whole methodology around it. And he said the foundation will always be love. That these boys need kindness, they need guidance, they need love. And so it can't be harsh, it can't be mean. It needs to always be in love. And I think really what he was saying is we need to use just the right amount of salt. Can't use too much, can't use too little. It needs to be just right. So I hope these are a couple examples that you feel like you can take in your own life and say, I want that. I want that just right amount of salt so that I can share it with others. All right, God bless.